Have you seen this Far Side cartoon? It's one where obviously you have a deer out in the forest with his friend looking at his birthmark, which is a target on his chest, and saying, "Bummer of a birthmark, Hal." This is what it looks like at times to be a leader. As a leader in ministry, you will face criticism. Now, as we talk about this particular module and facing difficult circumstances, we're going to talk about facing external criticism as well as facing internal criticism. For your discussion this week, you'll be listening to a podcast, and in that podcast, you'll be hearing about the internal critic. Some of that can be your own voice or the voices of others from your past that will kind of feed a narrative. And in that podcast, Steve Cuss will talk about some of the gospel truths that we need to listen to as we try to process some of those criticisms that we face internally in our own mindset or in our own heart. But in the course of this particular conversation, I want to talk about the reality of external critics. Now, in that podcast, you can actually listen to part 2 if you want to, and Steve Cuss will talk about external criticism, but he continues that over really the next 2 podcasts. For the sake of time, one of the things I want to recognize is that all of us filter criticism, especially external criticism, in different ways. In fact, you have a filter through which you tend to filter criticism. Think of the metaphor of a filter as every criticism comes through this filter, and the filter filters out certain things and lets other things through. Sometimes a personal pride filter, here's filter number 1, sometimes a personal pride filter will actually not let criticism through that should be allowed to be received. In fact, one of the things we discover in Scripture is that we should be able to receive words from a friend that might be hard to hear, but that can be trusted. That's actually wise and discerning. So the personal pride filter is actually a danger and inhibits us or creates some foolishness in us as a leader. So the personal pride filter is one that's hardened to input, doesn't hear input. It views all criticism as a personal attack. And honestly, some of the things in my own life, as I've had to learn how to navigate criticism, I've had to learn how to say these phrases that you see. I know that I'm not good at that. That's actually in some ways for me, part of my desire to get rid of this personal pride filter is to recognize there are some things that I need to grow in and learn. And so this was a phrase that I had to practice so that I could get rid of the personal pride filter. The other one really was this, is that, hey, I did or I will continue, I'm going to fail. And so a long time ago, this quote was helpful for me when facing criticism. This actually was pretty formational for me in my 20s walking through ministry. And Reggie McNeil says that it's okay for you not to be good at everything. Congratulations, that qualifies you for being human. So I don't know if you need to hear that or not, but that's something in my 20s and early 30s that I needed to process, is that God created me, but he created me, as we've already said, to live in community. That means I have weaknesses and need other people, but that also means that I have strengths that I can contribute to the body. And so when we face criticism, sometimes it's warranted criticism that we can learn and grow from. Let me also kind of add in here, sometimes criticism is our best teacher, in the same way that failure is a really good teacher. I received criticism one time from an elder's wife who is still a dear friend of mine. In fact, in many ways, she's kind of a surrogate mother or grandma to my kids. And to me, she functions in many ways kind of like a second mom. But one time I actually missed a meeting with her. And this is, again, early on in my ministry. I was incredibly busy and very distracted. And she sat me down and had some criticism for me. And to be honest, anytime I miss a meeting now, I remember those words of criticism from her that were quite healthy. And if I had the personal pride filter on, perhaps I would not have listened or learned from that criticism, but it actually shaped me as a leader and helped me learn and move forward. So we want to recognize these unhealthy filters that we have. Here's a second filter that I think is important to recognize, is sometimes we have what I call a people pleaser filter. Now, maybe these are just mine, and maybe you need to identify your own filters of how you filter criticism as it comes your way. Sometimes I receive criticism as an attack of the core of my identity because I wanted to please people, and my value as a human, my value in the kingdom was evaluated based upon if people were happy with me, pleased with me, or not. So I had to learn how to say some things like, and this is kind of cheesy, I'm not here to make you happy, I'm here to help you to grow. I had to learn that as I received criticism, my value was not based in whether or not people were proud of me, liked me, approved of me, and all of those things. So I would encourage you to evaluate. Again, these are 2 of mine that I have processed in my own leadership as we're talking about survival skills in ministry. I would encourage you to evaluate your own filters for criticism as we have this conversation this week. One of the illustrations that I've used for criticism is kind of like playing dodgeball. Sometimes you have to decide when someone's criticizing you whether to dodge the dodgeball completely to catch the dodgeball, and hopefully not to like throw it back at them, but to catch the dodgeball, or just like kind of disregard it and block the dodgeball coming your way. Don't over push that metaphor, but sometimes it is important for us to actually receive, to catch the criticism and actually to take it in and to listen to it. And sometimes it actually hits us aside the face and knocks us over. But other times it's important for us to be okay with actually letting things whiz by us and knowing that those are actually going to be normal things. In the process of doing that, I've developed and collected different categories that mentally, and I don't necessarily say this out loud to the person who's offering the criticism, but mentally I try to categorize the types of criticism that I'm receiving as a leader into these three types of criticism. The first one is the one that I call a drive-by shooter. This is someone, James chapter 3 talks about, the tongue being like a wildfire or leading someone astray. And Proverbs talks about, the tongue can be like a sword that just stabs people over and over again. This is that, like their tongue is a loose weapon. You notice this in their family, the friendships, and in the various environments, your church. This person walks into the room and people automatically start to duck. They're indiscriminate at who they're shooting. They just criticize everyone. And so you can, as an individual, start to recognize this kind of criticism and maybe even this kind of person. Steve Cuss in his podcast will share with you that in his church of over 1,200 people, he has about 6 of these people that he has qualified as an unhealthy critic, someone that he can, if the dodgeball's coming his way, kind of just duck out of the way. Now, again, that's not the metaphor categories he uses, but I think it definitely is a parallel to what he talks about in his podcast. I believe that's in the second episode that you're not required to listen to, but I would encourage you to if this is a topic that has been difficult for you or will be difficult for you as a leader. So maybe a drive-by shooter when it comes to criticism. Maybe it's someone in your family. Maybe it is someone in your church, or I don't know, maybe it's you. And we recognize that this form of criticism isn't healthy. The other thing that oftentimes categorizes this kind of a critic is that they actually won't respond to the relational reconciliation that you may offer to them. So you may offer to meet with them and they may actually not want to do that. Or if they do, they may continue to blow it up and continue to use anything that you have to say as ammunition against you. So there are some unhealthy dynamics when it comes to that. And again, this is one of those categories where you have to recognize it's going to happen. All you need to do is click on social media. There, we often call them trolls, to recognize that this is a part of how, especially in our modern day culture, we communicate with one another. And sometimes because of the digital forms of communication, which we'll get to in some of our other conversations in this module. So drive-by criticism, category number 1. Number 2, I've categorized this one, and sorry if this one seems a little bit odd when it comes to the metaphor, but this is how I've experienced it. This form of criticism is what I describe as, internally categorize as, emotional terrorism. This is the critic that walks into a room and emotionally, verbally explodes on other people so that he or she can prove a value point or get their way. So their goal is to strike fear into other people to either prevent something from happening or to cause something to go their way, a decision to go their way. And so I've seen this happen in eldership meetings and honestly in church services, in all staff meetings, as well as in all church kind of town hall environments. I could tell you individual stories about those who have exploded emotionally with a desire to get their way. Now, again, I have to evaluate myself and ask, do I at times do this? And am I at times this kind of critic, whether that be to my relationships in my family, relationships in my staff, or relationships with others? Am I at times an emotional terrorist and spewing criticism all over them and hate all over them so that they are afraid and therefore give in to my particular point of view? The third category is that of, again, if you don't like sports metaphors, come up with your own metaphor. But I had a high quality football coach. So this third category is what I call the head coach. I had a football coach that knew how to criticize and also how to, in that sense, encourage. Now, this encourage in the Bible can be an arm over the shoulder, or it can also be in football, kind of a hand on the face mask and getting in your face. Encouragement in the Bible can actually be either one of those. And so at some level, criticism can be an arm over the shoulder or a face-to-face kind of confrontation that may actually hurt at first. But at the same time, the motivation is fairly clear. Notice the distinctive here is there's a fairly clear indication of relational context and value, that you as an individual, even though criticism is coming your way, that you are valued as an individual and you're valued as a part of the organization or as a part of the team. In this sense, we recognize that we also have some shared values and perhaps excellence or a mission or some sort of team dynamic that is there. maybe even in discipleship. The criticism is in response to a shared commitment in following Christ in holiness. Proverbs 27 verse 6, I've alluded to this already, gets out this: faithful are the wounds of a friend. A friend should be able to speak some truth into your particular life. And so I want to encourage you, as you evaluate criticism, to kind of categorize it in these three categories. It doesn't always make it easy to receive criticism that comes in the form of drive-by shooting or emotional terrorism, but it may help you evaluate whether or not you need to catch it and internalize it or let it go by you. And again, your identity is established in Christ. We got through that in session number 1. You, if you have your foundation firm in him, should be able to, with feet firmly on the ground, navigate criticism with a little bit more health. And as you practice this, I think you'll get stronger and better at some of this discernment. That said, I also, during this season of my life, was reading through Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 21 through 22, really was a gut punch. It was convicting. It was God's form of criticism, a dodgeball that hit me in the face that I needed to catch and pay attention to. And here's what we read in that wisdom literature: do not take to heart all the things that people say. In other words, don't internalize them. After all, you might hear your servant cursing you, but in your heart, you know that many times you also have cursed others. Boy, this particular wisdom statement out of Ecclesiastes was one I needed to hear. After all, it's rather easy to become the drive-by shooter, to become the emotional terrorist or the unhealthy critic that lets words and criticisms flow about leaders of all kinds, all the way from the global scale, national scale, all the way down to the local scale, and even into your own church family and family. And so when other people criticize you, recognize with grace that you've also done the same thing. And so give them an extension of grace and mercy and understanding of our brokenness as humanity, and extend, again, mercy and grace to them because you yourself have been forgiven. That said, what is a healthy filter for criticism? Well, we've kind of talked about categorizing some of these. Let's talk about putting a healthy filter in place. Every 3 months, I change the air filters in my house. And perhaps it's a quality thing for us to do, to come at this and ask, maybe every now and again, I need to evaluate and reestablish the healthy filters that allow me to receive criticism and then also repel. So notice, receive and repel criticism based upon this filter. Filter number 1, the component of it is to just humbly listen at some level, again, to get back from to kind of prevent the pride filter. This is the opposite of that, is to actually receive some of these moments of criticism. We talk about in communication creating feedback mechanisms or feedback loops. You need to have some healthy feedback loops that allow people to give you feedback / criticism in a way that is healthy, rather than letting it build up pressure and explode. So maybe the best place isn't on social media, but how can people who are under you and work with you, how can they approach you and have conversations with you, maybe even about some concerns or criticisms? It's probably not a criticism observation box in your church, to be honest, but there may be some opportunities for feedback that you can give that create some healthy conversations. Oftentimes, I'm going to encourage those to be face to face at some level. Here's number 2. How do you honestly evaluate it? This goes back to the categorization of it earlier, but is it accurate? You have to ask that question. Is it insightful? Maybe it hurts, but is there something that you can actually learn? For instance, wow, I missed another meeting. Maybe I'm too busy. Maybe the way that I'm keeping track of time is not effective. In the particular case of the elder's wife, I learned the lesson that after church was not a good time for me to add something to my schedule. What had happened is that she had come up to me after a church service, after I'd preached a couple times and probably taught a Sunday school class in between, and she'd asked to schedule a meeting with me that following week. In that moment, I said yes, and probably got moved from that conversation right on to another conversation and got distracted and never added that meeting into my calendar. And so she showed up, and I was at a hospital call. And she took time out of her day to come to the church and to meet with me, and I was nowhere to be found. They knew where I was. I was at the hospital. So that criticism was accurate. It was insightful. And then I actually knew that the motivation was actually in love. She wanted me to grow as a leader. She herself was a strong business person, strong leader. And so I had to put some things in play as I listened to that criticism. One of the things that I learned is that if you want to schedule a meeting with me, this is still true today, nearly 15, 18 years later. If you want to schedule a meeting with me, I will ask you to email me. That way, when I move on from that particular conversation, the ball is still in your court to send me a communication of the dates and times we need to meet. And I will then, at my computer, when I am not distracted, be able to add that into my calendar. So over the course of the last 15 years since that criticism, it's actually changed my behavior. And it's moved me toward a position of health and wisdom. And so in so many ways, it's funny how that one little moment shaped me, but it's helped me become a better leader because of its insightfulness. Now, I also know that at times if I miss a meeting, which isn't very often, but if I miss a meeting, it's maybe a warning light on my dashboard that, again, I'm getting too busy, too distracted, and probably overstacking my time. And so I can actually pay attention to that indicator light in my life and respond accordingly. So as you honestly evaluate criticism coming your way, again, you have to ask, is it accurate? Is it coming from a heart of someone who is like a head coach, who cares about me? Is it insightful? And what's the motivation behind? Here's letter C. Here's the third one. Then at some point, you need to make an informed decision. John Ortberg, a number of years ago, again, I know with John Ortberg's story, there's some question marks maybe surrounding some of his leadership. And so you have to deal with that as you will. But I think this is a good insight. A leader can readily drift from mission to complaint management. And this is really important for you. You can spend your entire ministry merely responding to try to please people and make people happy and keep people from complaining. And you have to be discerning in how you navigate that. In his podcast, the second one that's not required of you, Stephen Gus talks about the fact that 6 people out of his 1,200 or 2,000 people who attend his church are what he would call the unhealthy critic. And he says, how unhealthy would that be? And he says, this is part of his story, to spend an inordinate amount of time responding to those criticisms and trying to answer all of their questions when you have all of these other issues and concerns in the church. And so focus on mission and evaluate those criticisms, but make sure that you don't drift into the shadow mission, John Ortberg would say, of complaint management. Personally, one of the statements I've always had is, as a leader, we have to recognize that we're called to get uncomfortable. And the story of Moses is actually one of those that reminds me of this dynamic. Over and over again, the people did what in response to Moses' leadership? They grumbled in the wilderness. And so even Jesus, as he is leading, we hear that same terminology. We hear that of the leadership of Israel, the Pharisees and the crowds at times. They grumble against Jesus. Well, this is that same sound. As a leader, you need to get used to hearing that sound. It is going to be a constant white noise for you. So your identity needs to be established. So again, Reggie McNeil, another quote, a couple more quotes that were helpful for me. Leaders are often too often obsess over negative feedback and yet blow off positive information. The way I've always described that is criticism is like a brick. Every time someone criticizes you, they hand you a brick or a cinder block, and it kind of weighs you down. But you can get, 100 different components or words of praise, notes of praise, and kind of, hey, good job or good sermon. And those are kind of like a balloon. But the problem is you get 100 of those balloons, and all you need is one cinder block, and the only thing you're paying attention to is one cinder block. This is true in email. Like, think about it. You can get 100 emails that are neutral or positive and get one that's a blaring criticism. I'd sometimes open my mail, and one letter I got was a criticism over a missions trip to Haiti after the earthquake that happened there a number of years ago. And they were criticizing, it was an anonymous letter, criticizing our motivation for going to Haiti to build a hospital. They didn't really know any of the motivations we had. In fact, that plan to go to Haiti had been there before the earthquake, and we had asked the local leadership, the national leadership there, if we should just send the money or still come, and they said that they still needed us to come. So this person didn't know any of the motivation that was there. And of course, it was anonymous, so we couldn't respond to them. So let that dodgeball go on by. But at the same time, that was like a brick. I mean, it went home with me. It went to dinner with me. It went, with my family that evening. And criticism can do that. And at the same time, all of the words of praise that we got about that mission trip probably just went on by. What if we inverted that and we're a little bit more balanced in how we paid attention to these words that come? Here's the last one. And this is obviously connected to module 1, where we talk about your identity and firmly establishing that in the gospel and who you are in Christ as created, as valued, and as valuable or useful in the kingdom. John Acuff says this, it gets at that. When you confuse your work with your identity, you mistake feedback for personal attack. When you have this confusion of what your identity is, and you think your identity is merely based in your performance, then this is going to rock your world. So I just want to encourage you, when it comes to criticism, to be able to process this in a way that is a part of this conversation with other leaders, learning to do it in a healthy way. Again, you have a podcast that you'll listen to that's part of your group discussion for this week. There are 2 more episodes after that episode on criticism, if this is something you want to drill down into a little bit more.